Hey there, and welcome back to week 9. So we're in our second to last week of this course. Sad times, I know. Seems like only yesterday that we were in week 1, but let's make sure we finish off strongly so that we can get you guys on your way to being guns at producing music. So we do have a big week of learning this week. Last week was more creatively and fun orientated, whereas this week we get a little bit more technical and we learn how to mix down our track. We do have to learn about a few audio effects to start with, and then some other little techniques, and then we'll get stuck into doing a mix down on our track. Now the mix down stage is very, very important. A lot of producers do kind of build this into the track while they're making the track. So by that I mean when you throw on EQs, and what we're going to learn about now is compressor and limiters. A lot of people do this while they make the track. That means that you don't have as much work at the end. But even for people that do this along the way, you're still going to have to come back at the end and do a final cleanup, final mix down before you actually master the track, and then export it and then release it. So the mix down entails, like I've been mentioning, it's to get all the sounds working together nicely. So making sure there's no clashing frequencies between similar sounds. So something like a kick and a bass, they're going to compete for that same space. Same thing with vocals, and let's say you have strings or guitar. They're going to be around the mids as well, so they're going to compete for the same space. And then if you have sounds on top of each other playing at the same time, because they're playing exactly the same time, you have to make sure that they are working together as well. The mixdown process is also where you can start to bring out a lot more clarity in your track, so making sure that overall it's not too muddy, that you have some nice frequencies covering across the spectrum. And this is where you really do your final check to make sure everything's sounding nice, cross-checking it against different speakers, maybe getting a few different people to listen to it, and then you can gather all of that feedback and really clean up the track. So for this first video here, we're going to jump into 3 new audio effects, and they're all going to be very vital. Well, 2 of them are going to be very vital, and one's a little more creative when it comes to mixdowns and just getting sounds to work with each other in general. It can also be used creatively and to fix some problems as well. What we're going to be looking at is the compressor, the limiter, and then also finally the drum bus. So to start off with, let's take a look at the compressor and what that does. I'm just going to shift over into my arrangement view, and I've got this track up the top here, which is just a drum track, so I'm just going to loop this, and I'll just play this for you guys. So let's grab our compressor and then I'll explain what it is. So this is what the compressor looks like when you drag it onto one of your tracks in Ableton. Now I'm going to give you a brief overview of the compressor, and then we'll take a look at the features and what they do. So what is a compressor? Again, like a lot of these effects, it's quite self-explanatory. So when you think of compression, you think of squeezing something together and, kind of squishing it down. That's exactly what the compressor does. So it will squish down your sounds, and in doing that, essentially your louder sounds will get quieter, and it will bring up the quieter sounds to make them louder. So just remember that loud sounds will get quieter, quieter sounds will get louder, because you're essentially compressing and squishing the sound. So if we take a look at this waveform here and we just listen to it again, you can hear and you can also see that the kick is really loud, and then the claps and the hats are really quiet relative to the kick. And just by looking at this waveform, we can see that there's a really loud sound here, 2 quiet sounds, and another loud sound. So what the compressor allows us to achieve is that we can squish this loud sound, and then these quieter sounds will get louder. So essentially, the more we squish this track down, the more those 2 sounds will be similar in volume. So now we have an idea of what the compressor is. We can go in and check out what these settings do, and then we'll use it so we can see what it actually does. So we'll start with the most important one, and that is the threshold here. So you can use this arrow and you can drag it up and down. Like the gates that we looked at in the last week, where we had a threshold on that and then everything that peaked above the threshold was let through. This works in a similar way. So we have a threshold here. Now what the threshold does is, we can see this is our original volume level here. If we bring this threshold down, what's going to happen is every time the volume peaks above -10 decibels, the compressor is going to reduce the gain and squash the track down. So because it's only our kick really that's going over this threshold, the kick is getting squashed. So this is getting squashed, but the hats and snares, or the hats and claps, stays untouched pretty much. And in doing that, the hats and snares are going to get louder the more we pull down this threshold. So if we come over to the left here, we've got a ratio. So what the ratio is it determines when something peaks above this threshold, how much does that volume push down, and how much gain reduction is there. So if we set this to 1:1, right now there's no gain reduction. Doesn't matter what we set this threshold to. So as soon as we start to push this ratio up, that's going to determine how much gain reduction occurs depending on how much the volume peaks above our threshold level. So if we have something that's like this kick, which is just blowing way above the threshold level, whereas the hi-hats and claps are down here, if we have this ratio set much higher, let's say to 5, you can watch this gain reduction meter here in the middle. That's what this GR is. And just watch when the kick hits, how much gain reduction there is compared to how much gain reduction occurs when the claps and hats are playing on their own. Okay, you can see there's quite a bit of gain reduction happening once that kick peaks above this threshold. That's because we've set the ratio much higher. So the way that this ratio works here is that this number on the left, let's say you have it set to 2. For every 2 decibels that something peaks above the threshold, it will only output 1 decibel. So if we have it set to 5 or somewhere near 5, for every 5 decibels that goes over, it's only going to output 1 decibel. So you can see how that will work when the kick peaks over that much. If it peaks over by 5, it's only going to actually output 1. You can see how much gain reduction is happening there. So these are going to be the 2 most important parameters when it comes to the compressor. Is where you set your threshold. So at what point will the compressor actually start working? And then how much do you want the compressor to crush this? So think of it that way. So if we have our threshold up here, because nothing's hitting the threshold, there's not going to be any compression. As soon as we bring this down, it's going to start to work a bit more. So if we really wanted to crush this kick and bring out the hi-hats and the claps, we can bring this threshold down, crank up the ratio. Something like that. Now if we actually listen to it, it almost sounds like they're the same volume now. So the kicks and the claps and the hats, they're sitting in a much similar space to with the compressor off like this, where the kick is really punching forward and the claps and those hats are sitting in the background. If we crush it with the compressor, now they're all sitting in a very similar space. So we've really tamed down that kick and brought out the clap and the hats. So we know what attack and release is because we've looked at this multiple times before. And it's the same thing with the compressor. So attack determines how long, when something peaks over the threshold, how long does it take for the compressor to work and actually push that back down. And then the release is once something drops back down below this threshold, how long does it take for the compressor to stop working? So we know what those two are. It's the same thing for the compressor. Now if we come over to the right here, I always like to make sure that I turn makeup gain off. As you saw, I turned it off at the very beginning. So what makeup gain does is it actually changes your output volume depending on what your threshold and ratio is. Whereas I like to keep my volume the same. So I turn this off. I don't want Ableton changing my volumes on my tracks. That way I can just change this as much as I want. And if I need to change the volume, I can do it myself by using this out. So this determines the output volume once the compressor's done its thing. And then down here we have a dry wet again, so we can, if we have a really harsh compressor like we have now, bring this down, clipping, so somewhere there. So if we have a really harsh compressor and we just want to tone it back a bit, instead of messing with these settings, we can just use the dry wet to bring the original back. That's the original. We can kind of dial how much compressor we want. So at the bottom here, we have something called an E. What this is, it's essentially like the return on the gate that we looked at last week. It's a way that we can give ourselves a little buffer so that if we had this set to 0, the compressor will be much harsher when it hits this threshold because there's no buffer. So essentially this is like a buffer. So as soon as it hits that threshold, it's going to knock it down straight away. Whereas if we start to add a little bit of knee here, we can smooth that off so that it kind of preempts when the compressor has to work. So if we have this at 6 decibels, when someone gets within 6 decibels, it's going to start to slowly ease into that compression. Down here, we have 3 different little symbols. These are different view modes. So we can open this up. If you'd like to see your curve better, you can use this. So same thing, we have still have a threshold and gain reduction here. But when I move this, it just displays it in a different way. So if I move the ratio, I find this one a little more confusing. I actually don't really use it too often. I always just stick to this because I can see what's going on. But if you do like this view, feel free to use it. And there's also this view here. This one is more similar to the gate in that we can see the waveform. And then we can see how much the compressor is actually pushing it down by this yellow line here. So if my ratio down, there's not much reduction going on. As soon as I push this up, you'll see that yellow line really increase. And then the threshold is this blue line here, which we can move like that, or with this number up here. Okay, so that's basically the compressor and what the compressor is. I hope that makes sense, and hopefully you understand what that is now, because it is a very vital piece of equipment, I'm going to call it, when it comes to Ableton and production in general. You're going to be using a lot of the compressor, especially during this process here, so the mixdown process. And I do want to note with the compressor that you will use it more prominently on organic sounds and like recorded sounds as opposed to electronic ones. Because typically electronic sounds don't have much dynamics, they don't vary that much. Whereas a singer, or if you're recording instruments, you're going to have some really quiet bits and then some really loud bits, and you want to kind of bring that together a little bit so that it doesn't jump out in the track too much. And on the flip side of that, you don't want to compress too much because then everything's going to... You might be familiar with the term sausage waveform, but essentially that's when something's over-compressed and over-limited. And this waveform here just looks like a flat and fat sausage, and there's no dynamics like this, where you have loud sounds and quiet sounds. It's literally just the same volume all the way through. So that's more prominent in, I'd say, commercially released dance tracks or EDM, where they're trying to get as much loudness as possible. They will do that. But that's the compressor. This is probably the most complicated one out of the 3 we're looking at, but I do want to show you on the vocals as well. So I've got this vocal here. So I'm just going to use it on this part here. We can just tell by the waveform that we've got a kind of quiet bit, and then she sings a little louder here. So this is where the compressor comes to life in scenarios like this, when you do have a singer that's singing a really quiet bit, and then they belt out some loud notes, and you want to tame that down a bit so you don't blow everyone's eardrums when they're listening to the track. You do want some dynamics, don't get me wrong. You do want that variation in the voice, but the compressor can help just to tame it down a little bit.
So I'm
going to loop this section here.
Is it all in me or just one part? So when you hold my hand.
That was quite harsh on my ears. It was fine through here, but then that really jumped out at me. So let's use the compressor to tame it down a little bit. Going to throw a compressor on. Now with vocals, you can afford to turn the ratio up a little bit more because there's a lot more variation. So I tend to go with something quite high, around the 5-ish, 4 to 5 mark.
Is it all?
And then we can just bring the threshold down.
Is it all in me or just one part? So when you hold my hand,
So I'm just going to play this loud part here and just bring this threshold
my
down.
hand,
Once again, turn makeup off.
my hand,
Maybe the ratio up a little bit.
my hand. Is it all in me or just one part? So when you hold my hand.
Okay, so that sounds a lot more pleasant already. So we brought the threshold down, turned the ratio up, and now the volumes between this and this aren't so drastic that it's going to hurt our ears. It just does a really good job of taming it down so that it all sounds a little more pleasant.
Is it all in me or just one part? So when you hold my hand.
And that part isn't as harsh.
Is it all in me or just one part? So when you hold my hand.
And then we can see the gain reduction doing its work down there.
Is it all
it's not really
in
doing
me
much
or
here.
Just one part? So when you hold my hand.
And then there, it kicks
Is it
in.
all?
If we want it to kick in sooner, we can mess around with these. But don't take the attack down too much because you're going to start to get...
Is it all in me or just one?
You can start to get a little bit of clicking.
Is it all in me or just one?
And you can really tell when the compressor's hitting. Whereas I think default's fine, like 2 milliseconds. But you can mess around within this vicinity. Because this sound isn't a fast sound, see how she slowly rises to that volume? Having the attack slightly higher will be fine. We don't need to bring the attack down much. Whereas if we had some, let's say some fast sounds like drums, a really fast drum beat, and we wanted to compress that, we might need to bring the attack down so that it can capture when that peaks above the threshold. If the attack's too slow, and we have drum sounds that are peaking above, those are going to get through without being compressed. Much like this kick here. Just demonstrate it really quickly. We have our attack too slow, like this. It's just not, the compressor doesn't have time to work, and that kick's still getting through and punching through the mix. The more we bring this down, now it's going to start to work quicker. Okay, that's all I want to cover with the compressor for now. We are going to be using a lot more of it, so don't fret if you don't understand everything now. I'm sure it'll sink in over time once we really start using it. So the next thing I want to look at is the limiter. So let me grab a limiter here. Just by looking at this, you can already tell that it's much simpler than the compressor. That's why I wanted to cover the compressor first, because it's a bit more in-depth. But what is a limiter? Again, the name pretty much tells you what it is, but essentially what a limiter is we have a similar thing where we have a ceiling, and then everything that goes above the ceiling, instead of the compressor where everything that goes above the threshold gets pushed down, what happens with a limiter is everything that goes above the threshold just gets cut off instead of getting pushed down. So a limiter is much harsher in the way it works. Instead of reducing the gain to bring it back down below, it just cuts it off. So we can use this on this drum beat here. Just loop this again. So what we can do is reduce this ceiling here until we see the limiter start to work, and then that tells us how much gain reduction is occurring. And just listen out for the kick. As I bring this ceiling down, you're going to start to hear it get cut out. So the claps and the hats are still there, but that kick has really lost a lot of impact. I'll compare it to the compressor. So the compressor is a lot softer in the way that it works. You're still reducing gain, but it's not exactly cutting things off at a certain volume level. Whereas the limiter, it's not letting absolutely anything above this ceiling here. So it's just basically preventing clipping if we have this set up here. We have this set to, let's say, 0 decibels. the loudest volume, and then I push up this gain. That's going to work in a similar way. So I've pushed it quite loud, but we're still not clipping because the limiter is literally just not letting anything above 0 decibels in, and it's just cutting it off there. So when I say cutting it off, I don't exactly mean that it's chopping the waveform. It's still reducing gain, but it's much harsher in the way that it works. So it will kind of hammer it on the head straight away instead of the compressor pushing it down. So think of it that way. So the compressor is a little bit softer, has a bit of leeway, whereas the limiter is like, no, you can't go above this level. I'm hitting you on the head and putting you back down. So if we push the limiter too far, we start to get quite a bit of distortion now. But you can see how loud the track is, or this drum track is, but it's still not clipping above 0. So essentially we can add a lot of loudness with this. But the more you push it, the more the quality is going to drop. So yeah, don't be too heavy-handed with the limiter. But yeah, there's not many controls on this guy, so I just pretty much showed you them. You can bring the ceiling, you can leave the gain at 0 decibels and then just bring the ceiling down. And that will just add more and more gain reduction and the volume will drop. Or if you leave the ceiling at a certain level, let's say you want the track, let's say you don't want this track to exceed -5, you can set it in here, and then you can push the gain up until the limiter starts to work. And that's going to be a similar thing. So now it won't actually go above -5 decibels on the master. We do have a couple of options. So we got stereo here. So stereo will just limit the track as a whole. And if we set it to left and right, it will limit the left and right independently of each other. So if we have a sound that has slightly different information in the left and right, so this one kind of does, but it's pretty much the same. Those two green bars there are the right and the left. If we look at it here, we can see it much more detail in the session view. So you can see that the green bars are moving up and down quite a similar time. That's because the left and right are basically identical. Apart from there, so maybe the hats and the claps have some stereo information and they're slightly different from left to right. That right one's dropping a little more. So you can process them separately, but honestly, unless you want to get into nitty-gritty details, I usually just process as stereo. And then we have a look ahead here. This is basically how quickly is the limiter going to react. So the smaller we set this, the faster it's going to react. But then with that, obviously it's going to be much harsher, so it's going to distort much quicker as well. So I usually just have this set on 3 milliseconds and that's fine. We have a release again, so we know what that is by now. And it's grayed out at the moment because we have auto on. So with auto on, the limiter will predict what the release should be depending on what sound's coming in through the input. So I usually leave it on auto unless you want to tweak the release yourself. But yeah, that's basically the limiter. So you can think of it like a compressor, but it's just a harsh compressor. And it just absolutely won't let anything above a certain threshold through. And to do that, it will just keep on squashing the waveform. But be wary, you can introduce distortion a lot quicker with this. Okay, so that's the limiter. Now we're going to take a look at one last thing for this video, and that is the drum bus. So at the bottom here, I have this little drum beat that I wrote in before. And let's just take a listen to it. Cool, so we got our little beat. Now I'm just going to throw a drum bus on this. So let me explain the drum bus real quick. Essentially, what the drum bus is, it's an all-in-one workstation, or like an all-in-one solution for drums. So if you have a drum rack, we have multiple drums that are grouped together. You can throw the drum bus on the whole group or the whole group of drums like we got here. So I've got a kick, snare, hat, and then an open hat. I've literally just thrown drum bus on all of them. So it's affecting all these sounds at once. And it gives us a way to flavor our drums all in this one little audio effect instead of throwing on different effects on different drum sounds. This gives us a really quick solution. As far as what it actually does, the drum bus is essentially like a saturator, compressor, limiter, and maybe like a tube amp all in one. So it's going to add that warmth, saturation. You can add a bit of crunch, you can add more bass, you can squash it down a bit. Yeah, it's sort of a combination of all those things, and you have these little controls where you can tweak different aspects of your drums. The first one we'll look at is the drive here. You can think of this as like the drive on a saturator. So the more that I push this up, the more it's adding that saturation. Then we have the crunch. This basically just affects the higher frequencies. So if I tweak this, you can see the upper end is popping out a lot more now for those hats and that snare. Whereas down here it's a little more dull. But the bass isn't really affected. So if we want to affect the bass, we have this boom here. This is going to affect just the low frequencies. So this kick is really going to start booming once we, excuse the pun, but it's really going to start booming once we crank this up. So we'll just listen to the bass and that kick. And just like that, we've almost turned this kick into like a hip hop 808. So down here, the kick is snappy. It's quite light. Once we crank this up, we're adding a lot of sub to that kick now, a lot of meat to it. Below the boom, we have this frequency. What this determines is when we crank this boom up, what frequency range is it going to focus on to enhance. So at the moment it's at 50 Hertz. That's kind of the sub region, is around that 50 Hertz mark. If we bring this up, we can affect different sections, and we can hear that in the tone as well. A cool thing that you can do with this is that you can actually adjust the frequency to play the specific note of the bass that you want. So if we look down here, it's showing us what note it is, or whatever it's closest to. So at 50, it's playing a G. If we move this up, it starts to play different notes. It's similar with something like a Spectrum. If we open this, if you just look in the bottom left there where these numbers are, down here, while I move my mouse, at 50 we're playing a G, and then as we move up we're playing up the notes. So we can tweak that. But it shows you down here anyway, so I don't need to use anything like a Spectrum. Just so you're aware. So you should be able to hear this changing depending on what you're listening on. It might not come through as much on smaller speakers or certain headphones as well. You definitely hear these on the Beats by Dre. So what the decay is you can hear it's quite sustained, that boom now. Like the original kick sounds like this. That's the original kick. When we've added that big boom, we can tweak how much fall off occurs. So if we don't want that bass note to ring out as much, we can bring down the decay. Now it's a bit more punchy. If I push this up, it's a really long sustained note. Cool, so you can play around with that, it's a lot of fun. This drum bus is really good. I use it all the time on my drum tracks and even my separate drum sounds as well. Just a really quick way to get that extra saturation. Back to the crunch here for our high end. We have this which adjusts the amount. We have a damp here which essentially works like a filter. So if we want it less harsh, we can bring this down. And then it's going to start to dull those higher sounds quite a bit. We push it back up. We get all that top end back. Now it's really bright. There, you can play around with that as well. This thing down here, transients, I play around with it quite a bit. So I think we covered what transients are in a previous video. I think around when we did sampling maybe. But just in case you're unaware, transients are like this shape of the waveform where the sound occurs. So it's basically when the sound begins and happens, which is right here. All these little short waveforms that you can see which are creating the sound. Every time we speak or make a sound, we create that transient. So coming back to the drum rack and our drum bus, we can adjust the transients. So if we pull this back down, we're going to make the drums much snappier. So let's just listen to it. So you can hear how much snappier it is. The sounds aren't ringing out as much. Whereas if I go the other way, now it's accenting those transients a lot more. Especially in the top end of the frequencies as well. Whereas here we're only getting that very beginning with the upper end of the frequencies. The very first hit of the sound. And then as we bring this out, we're affecting more of it. You can think of this as like, this is the top end, the mid to high end. This affects the bottom end. And then this is essentially your saturator. So we have different settings for the saturator or the drive. You can go harsher with it. Bring this down a bit. You can also do that with the output here. And then this comp button down here basically adds a little compressor, like a built-in compressor. And we can adjust the input level with this. So it's really like an all-in-one solution to adding a bit of character and spice and warmth to your tracks. You don't have to just use this on drums as well. You can use this on anything. So you can throw it on any track, see what it does, try it on some instruments, try it even on your voice, see what happens. You might get some cool effects from this as well. I like to use this quite subtly. So I've just found these settings here, so I'll push it a little bit harder, but just listen to the before and after. That was before drum bus. And then after. Before. After. As you can tell, it adds a lot more oomph to the drums. So if your drums sound a little bit weak, this is a great solution, a really fast solution as well to just make them hit a little bit harder and add a little bit of warmth and character to them as well. Okay, so that's those three plugins. I don't want to spend too long in this video. Hopefully those all make sense and that you can start using those straight away. So now we know what the compressor is, we know what the drum bus is, and we know what the limiter is. So feel free to go off and play with these new audio effects that you learnt. Otherwise, I'll catch you in video 2.